Hi, and welcome to the How Not to Think podcast, the podcast that gets you thinking about your thinking and things like outdated stereotypes, binary thinking, and all that sort of stuff. I'm Dr. Howard Rankin, and I'm delighted to have with me today Jennifer Thornton. She has special and expansive knowledge in the area of corporations and corporate development, particularly in relation to leadership, engagement, hiring, development, all those important things. She knows more about it than I do, so I'll shut up. And welcome, Jennifer. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's going to be a great conversation.
I think it will be. And as usual, I ask the guest just to give a little background for our listeners and viewers, to how you got to be at this point in your life.
So, I grew up in the retail industry. And back when I was younger and I was thinking about getting my first job, I won't necessarily date myself, but it was definitely before people were shopping on the internet. And I love to hang out in the mall. So, I wanted to work in the mall and dreams come true. I worked in the mall. And little did I know at that time, I was young. I loved fashion. I loved socializing. But what I didn't know I was going to learn is all about leadership. And I think what people don't recognize is when you walk into your local mall, all of those managers are running multi-million dollar businesses and they're making hiring decisions and staffing decisions and handling, HR issues. They're motivating employees. They're trying to think about who are my best people for what shift and why. And you walk in and you think they're just selling jeans and t-shirts, but they really are running these multi-million dollar stores. And so that's where I got my start in leading teams. And, I progressed from there and I worked in the operations side, many different levels and different jobs throughout the years. Then halfway through my traditional corporate career, I switched over and went over to the HR side of the business. And the reason I did that is that I never really got my results like most people. I wasn't highly competitive. I didn't want to be number one just to be number one. I loved building teams and watching people see their goals come to life and the fun of, having numbers and crushing those as a collective team. And so because I got my results through talent, I moved over to the HR side to start to specialize in that. And through that, I did many different things. But when I ended my traditional corporate career, I was the head of an international HR group. So I got to do really interesting things all around the world. And that looked fantastic on social media, looked very glamorous, but it was exhausting. But it was so much fun. I learned so much about myself. And just, anytime you get dropped off in a foreign country and you have to figure out how to work in it, you learn a lot about yourself. And so after doing that for several years, I decided to go off on my own and again, do what I love and really what I'm the best at and stop doing things I'm not that great at. And what I love doing is helping people understand how to have incredible talent strategies, how to deploy talent, how to lead talent. And at the end of the day, making sure that that talent delivers on the business results. So that's what we do today at 304 is we focus on talent strategy and leadership education.
And 304 Coaching is your company. I wondered why 304, whether you came up with that at 4 minutes past 3 one afternoon, or the 4th of March.
Almost. Yeah. So it was the craziest thing. I get a phone call. I'm still at my traditional job. I'd made the decision to go off on my own. I had a former executive I work with that knew I was going to. And so she calls me one day and she's like, I need you to come in tomorrow and pitch to my CEO. We need to bring in an HR consultant. I want it to be you. And I was like, I don't even have a name for my business yet. And she's like, you better figure it out tonight. And I was like, okay. And so that night I'm like looking at a blank piece of paper. I have to have a name and, find a logo and all of this. And 304 is a combination of dates. It's always been my lucky number. And so
Okay.
I just went with my lucky number. And you know what? It's worked ever since there. I actually got that job. It was my first big client. And it's been a lucky number since then.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I figured it was something like that. So that's great. I like the authenticity of that. Um, Now you obviously have a lot of expertise in a number of things, particularly the hiring process. And I was interested in that because one of the things that you seem to have challenged is the sort of conventional hiring process and questionnaires and personality questionnaires, and you're questioning whether that's really the best way to assess somebody. Tell me a little bit more about your thinking on that, because I think I'm going to end up agreeing with you.
I always love when someone says they're going to agree before I even speak. How great is that?
Yeah.
So, when I look at hiring, when we hire someone, it fails a lot of the time, whether we're not happy as a person who hired it, or that employee's not happy, or something breaks down in between. And I always love when I get the phone call that says, I have this team of people and they don't know what they're doing and they're not doing everything. And they're all mad. And my first question, as soon as they calm down and tell me all these problems, I always say, what about your leadership made this possible?
Mhm.
Because we chose those people to be on our team. And so something we're doing isn't right. So first, I get leadership to recognize that anyone on their team that isn't the right fit or wasn't as successful, they made that decision, not the employee, so that they can start to really take ownership in that development. The next thing that is, I think, different than traditional, what we're taught is we're taught, oh, if you need someone, you go hire someone and you look at traits, all the stuff we're told. But I always say to people, before you ever think about who you need to hire, you have to think about what you want them to do. And oftentimes we throw payroll at our problems. And so we see a team that's overwhelmed and overworked. And so we think, well, we'll just hire someone and then it'll be fine, right? And then we hire someone and it's still out of control. But what we don't stop and say is, why is this team struggling? Is it, do they have the tools and resources that they need? Do they have the leadership education or the training? Are we asking them to do work that's mismatched? I mean, there is 100 questions we could ask ourselves before we ever decide if we're going to hire someone. And if we are going to hire someone and say we're going to spend $60,000 on someone, what if we said, let's look at this and spend $60,000 on upscaling our team so they're more productive and doing the work around removing roadblocks. And then you have an incredibly productive team that, that money pays off year after
Yeah.
year,
Yep.
which I think is so good when you stop and think about, how do you spend those dollars?
Yeah. Yeah. Reminds me of a discussion that I frequently have about education, where the teacher explains something and the kid or kids don't get it, don't understand it. And the teacher says, "You're stupid. Why don't you get it?" It was actually the teacher's job to explain it. So if the kid doesn't understand it, by and large, it's probably your fault, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, and you
Uh,
think about that mind switch between, I get to go to sleep at bed and I did nothing wrong and I'm going to blame it on that other person. Well, as soon as you start to go into blame, you've given up your control in that situation and you've set someone else up for continuous failure. And I just love your approach of allowing that educator to take responsibility, because then they have control in changing the outcome.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, depending on what stage you are in the process, whether we're talking about, kindergarten or elementary school or a major corporation, um, somebody not taking ownership is not going to go down well with the team, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. They're always
Yeah.
blaming us
Mhm.
when, why doesn't, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's some people that are really good at that. Some people that stay in position for quite some time through the blame of others. And, that's another great leadership skill that I think executives have to possess. And that's asking the right questions when things go wrong, because they really need to start to understand what was the root cause, not the outcome, not the lost revenue, not the lost client, but what led up to that, so that we can impact that so that that doesn't happen in the future.
Is really understanding the dynamic and the processes, right? Moving well beyond egos and personal stuff, right? Which, hopefully is changing a bit. For a long while, wasn't that, it was the leader is right. The lead, he's not going to accept any idea unless he thinks it's his, all that sort of stuff. And I see that one of the things that we will get to talk about is the 7 deadly sins of leadership. I suspect that might be one of them, is not accepting ownership of responsibility.
Absolutely, it is. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Let's just go back to the hiring process again, because I think I'm fascinated by this. Yeah, a lot of time people think, well, this is the sort of job we want in general, and these are probably the characteristics we want. So we'll assess people on this and we'll chat to them, and we might combine some informal impression with formal impression. I can see that not working terribly well.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of assessments are overrated. I suspect you think the same way too. A lot of assessments are overrated. Some of them can be faked.
Yep.
You don't have to be a genius to work out, what the question typically is asking you to do. So I agree that there's a limit. I mean, not that it's completely useless. Might be a little guidepost, but should not depend on that entirely at all.
Yeah, and a lot of organizations use assessments. It's very common to use them. I always say make sure they're EEOC compliant. If you're in the US, there is a Supreme Court case that gives the guidelines. And I meet people using things and I'm like, oh, okay, that's not EEOC compliant. Please don't. But, if you decide to use an assessment, and there are a handful that have really strong validation studies, anywhere from adjective based to a full day psychoanalytic type, like there's everything in between. Obviously, there's reasons why you would use one or another, but some of the most popular ones definitely do not have the validation. I always tell people, if you're going to use one, ask for the validation report, ask for the taxonomy report. A great organization would be more than happy to show off their research. But
Right.
if they don't want to show off their research, there's a reason why. And it has to be part of the conversation. And really designing your hiring process is incredibly important. And I don't think we put enough time into that. We just say, well, you first talk to the recruiter, then you talk to the HR person, then you talk to the hiring manager, and someone signs off on you. And I just think that that's such a 20th century way to look at it. You have to build a relationship with someone, and you have to recognize that when you make a hiring decision, you're changing the course of someone's life. You're impacting their family, their finances, their resume, all of that. So when you just haphazardly hire someone, and you hire someone for a job that they're not going to be successful in for whatever millions of reasons that it could be, then you're impacting their future. And I don't think as leaders, we really understand how big of a deal it is when we hire someone, and how we really are impacting their future long term.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that's maybe relevant here is a question that I ask all my clients who were in education, whether that was first grade or college. I asked them this question: what's your favorite subject? And very often I got the same answer, and it wasn't a subject, and it wasn't recess. And I've asked some very high up people in education about this, and they didn't get it. But the answer is the subject taught by my favorite teacher.
Ah, yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yes.
that speaks to the connection, how a connection between two people is critical.
Absolutely.
It's not about, it's not an extra thing. It's critical. It's critical in how people want their motivation, their function, everything. And so that is, I would think, is very important part of the hiring and team process, right?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I was thinking, well, what was my favorite subject? And it was history. And I remember the exact teacher, she had taught college, moved to a small town where I grew up, and then had to teach high school. So here we have a college level professor in high school. And she not only taught us what she was supposed to, right? But she taught us how to think about history in a different way, in a more elevated way. And, how to, how history can be a predictor. It just all of those things, right? And you're right. I remember everything about her. And that's why I fell in love with history, which I still love today.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned history because I studied that as a junior and senior in my British education. And there were two history teachers. One was the guy I had, which was really produce all the dates, when was this battle? When was that? And the other guy sounds a bit more like your teacher. He really wasn't interested in that, but he wanted to take you back and what it would be feel to be like in 1776 or 1843. That's history. What I was learning was just regurgitation, Yeah, I'm glad you had a teacher that gave you that, because it's phenomenal. But that's what happens when you can really relate and engage with people. Your not just your motivation, but your productivity, your thought process just gets elevated, right?
Yeah, and it expands your mind map. Our world is our experiences, and that's how big your mind map is, and it can't be any bigger than your experiences. But when you think about exposing yourself to history, you can expand your mind map in such a different way. Even from, one of my favorite thing to read is historic fiction. I love historic fiction. I love
Mm-hmm.
and I love reading about strong women in historic fiction and what they've been through. And I think about myself and I think about their decisions and how does that and how would I, handle some of the things that are in the book. But I think it's one of the best ways to really expand your mind map is through understanding history and putting yourself in those situations.
Yeah, it really helps define context and the importance of context. And
Mhm.
yeah, excellent, excellent. So you've created a hiring assessment process that is different from what we've been talking about, which is about really trying to understand exactly what it is you need and how you're
Mhm.
going to get that, correct?
Yeah. And, when I think about the hiring process, it's unique for every company. It's
Mm-hmm.
never one size fits all. But the pieces in it that we often forget is having that potential person meet with their coworkers, because that's who they're going to be working with. They're going to be a huge part of that person's success. And so if, you have one person and they have three business partners, let those three business partners have lunch with that person and let them get to know them, and let the person who's interviewing with your organization decide if they want to work with you, because that's kind
Mm-hmm.
of it. This is a two-way relationship, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
We're dating through this. It's not just I pick you
Absolutely.
and you have to come with me no matter what. And I think that's so important when you start to think. And then on day one, when that person shows up, they know someone, they have some context. And so they're going to, reduce that fear in their mind of, I got to meet so many people. They already know people.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing is giving people small, very small projects to learn how they think and have them come back and present that. And when I worked in Europe, that was so common, but it's not common in the United
Hmm.
States. And I think it's a big miss. And I think that's where I fell in love with that process. And I often work with clients and we talk about that. And, it's made everyone so much more comfortable in the decision on both sides because
Right.
they shared in a conversation around work. So there's all different things you can put in it that I think create a conversation versus an interview.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that. So you're actually saying you would recommend giving an applicant a task to do,
Mhm.
and then they come back and discuss how they did it, how they
Mhm.
approached it. Yeah,
Mhm.
I really like that. I think that would
Yeah.
be very effective.
Yeah, I did it recently with a client. They had a really important hire to make, and they hired the wrong person for the same position multiple times. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was like we were all on pins and needles, like we've got to get this right. And we had that person. One of the things that the previous people in that position had struggled with is managing the P&L. And so we put together a mock P&L. We threw some like very obvious odd things, and we said, "Here's a P&L, look at it." We had like 3 questions. Tell us what comes to your mind and be prepared. We'll talk about it. and they hit everything. And then we figured out how they were thinking about it. He was like, well, if this is like this, these are the questions I'd want to know. And so the CEO and this person got to engage in a conversation about finance to see how that works, right? Because they're going to have a lot of those
That's right.
conversations.
Yep.
And the CEO felt so comfortable. The candidate, this was a big move for him. He wasn't looking for a job. He had to move cities, but because they engaged in that conversation, they both were so comfortable that, offer was made, it was accepted, and that person's in role right now doing incredibly well. But it was how it happens. It happens through conversations.
It seems so obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I know, right?
Let's try out a little bit of work and see how well we work
Yeah.
together. It
Hmm.
just seems so obvious, but it's,
Yeah.
yeah, brilliant, really.
Hmm.
That's exactly what you want to know. You
Hmm.
want to see this person doing what they're going to be doing and
Yeah.
relating to them in that way. Yeah.
Hmm.
Total sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
That's
think the
great.
other thing too is it reduces fear, because before he even worked for the organization, he had the opportunity to tell the CEO his opinion about something.
Right.
And when you think about fear in the workplace, I always say a leader's number one job is the reduction of fear. That's really your only job, because nothing can
Mhm.
happen if we're not reducing fear. And so they started their relationship through conversation around the truth. And that's really impactful when you start your relationship that way. So I think, there's a lot of kind of fingers that come off that project that are really helpful.
And I saw you do have some training on that, getting rid of the fear, right?
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had the most incredible opportunity to work for a woman named Judith Glacier. And she spent 40 years studying the neuroscience of conversations in the workplace and how did that impact results and how did that impact relationships. And it was such a gift to be able to study underneath her. She has since passed, and I feel like one of my missions in life is to carry her work on, because she changed my life. She really changed how I thought about leadership and how I thought about people. And what I want people to always recognize is what we know about the brain is only about 20 to 25 years since we've really been able to study the brain. But yet we were taught to lead in these best practice leadership styles that came out of the industrial revolution, the 70s and 60s and 40s. Like it came out of a whole different world. So not only is it a different world today, we also know all this stuff about the brain. And so we've got to lead in a different way, because how we were leading was breaking down. 2020 broke it in half. If there was any cracks, it definitely broke in half. But then how do we start to lead in the 21st century? And I think it's through the understanding of the neuroscience of the brain, how to reduce fear, and that your language has a direct impact on someone's chemicals, and then how do they respond and obviously produce your results.
Yeah, absolutely. Good time for me to plug a book that I just brought out called Power Talk: The Art of Effective Communication.
Mhm.
It's the second edition. I wrote the book quite some time ago. The reason that I wrote it initially was here I was as a practicing psychologist and coach and all that stuff, and no one had ever presented or had I ever taken a course on communication. It made no sense to me. And so I, started really researching and then put it into a book. And it's critical. It's really, really critical. It's so obvious. But most people aren't trained in that. They're not trained to think about that in an appropriate way. And how can you not do that if you
I
really want to
know.
maximize performance?
I know. And again, it kind of goes back to that original thing I said, when that executive calls me and they're all up in arms, my first question always is what have you done to create this atmosphere where this is how people perform? And oftentimes one of the most common things I hear is my team doesn't make their own decisions. My team can't come up with new ideas. And if I'm on vacation, nothing gets done.
Mhm.
And there's a reason why you've created an environment where maybe perfection is the only thing allowed. Therefore, don't do any work, because if you mess up, then you're in trouble. So I got to wait for you to tell me exactly what color pen to use so that I'm perfect. And so, of course, people aren't going to make their own decisions. I mean, they're just not to. Or every time someone brings a new idea to you, you're like, no, no, that's wrong. Well, guess what? They're going to stop bringing ideas to you. They're going to want to like not be told they're wrong. Like it's
Exactly.
just so amazing how our language really creates the behaviors in our team.
Yeah, and one of the golden rules, I think, of communication is if you want somebody to communicate with you in any setting, you've got to create the right communication environment.
Mhm.
And that right environment is respect,
Yes.
authenticity.
Mhm.
I mean, if somebody thinks, well, if I'm going to present this, they're going to make a fool of me, or they're going to laugh, or they're going to reject me, or they're not going to tell you. I mean, you don't need to be a psychoanalyst to work that out. Probably most people have been through that, maybe in their families. I'm not
Mhm.
going to tell my mom anything or my dad because he'll just scream at me, so I won't tell him anything.
Yeah.
Which then becomes the way in which you communicate or don't through the rest
Mhm.
of your life. Um, so it's so fundamental, but it's so widespread.
Mhm.
It's so all encompassing. And I think those are the things that you are addressing in the work that you're doing with leaders and with groups. And that is critical.
Yeah. And it's so simple. The things that we say that we don't even recognize. One of the things that I talk a lot about to have a growth mindset and to be a leader that has growth minded teams, I always say, ask the team what could go right. Because we're always like, all right, we've got this plan. What could go wrong? All right, well, let's just turn the fear button on and then let's try to make sure nothing goes wrong. But what if we said, what could be possible and what could go right? All right, this could go right. Now, what do we have to do to make sure that goes right? And that's just a simple language change, but it changes the mind. Or, other one is like, what else could be true? Because,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
process information, we create these stories. And
Mm-hmm.
because we're fear based animals, we create fearful stories. I'm like, if you're going to make up a story and you don't know the truth, at least make up one that's purposeful and serves you. Like, like make up a
Yeah,
good one.
absolutely. And we are storytellers, so you might as well tell a good story instead of
Yeah.
a destructive one.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. We all have, and you obviously have, as have I, pivotal moments in your career that
Mhm.
really highlight something. And what we're talking about now, happened to me. I was still in London. I was doing therapy and I was doing couples counseling with this couple.
Mhm.
And the woman's complaint about her husband was he never said anything. He didn't really open up. He didn't, and that's true. He kind of sat there and really didn't say anything. About the fourth session, he finally got the courage to get up and say, well, blah, blah, blah. Whereupon his wife said, why the hell do you think like that? Where did that come from? I mean, and he stood up and said, and that's why I never say anything, and stomped out the room.
Yeah.
Perfect. What a
Perfect.
lesson. What a
Yeah.
lesson.
Yeah. And that is what happens all of the time. We train people how to respond to us. They're responding to us for the way that we have. And over time we build those neural pathways that so when you enter the room as an executive, you have history. There's been stories told about you. You've engaged with people, and whatever they think is what likely will happen is how their body's starting to chemically respond. And you can't I always do love to, like, when I start working with an executive through conversation intelligence and starting to work on this, like, okay, so I just need to go in and tell them to trust me. I'm like, yeah, that didn't really work either. This is a process. But they
Yeah.
just think they can go and tell them to
Oh,
trust him.
oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. After years of not trusting them, that's going to work, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
Perfect. Yeah. Uh, yeah. No, that's exactly right. And you're right. I mean, people train others how to react to them,
Mhm.
how to take them. If people have doubts about them, authenticity, that they're not gonna open up. They're gonna feel very inhibited about all sorts of things in their interactions.
Mhm.
And that's going to impact every aspect of that relationship and their performance. And
Yeah.
that's what you're working on, it seems to me.
On, yeah, trying to change the way we feel about work, one conversation at a time. because it really does impact our the way we live our life. It impacts communities. And when you think about how you make someone feel in the workplace, that goes home with them. It doesn't just check at the door. And so if you've treated someone poorly during the day and they go home and have dinner with their family, they're not as connected, they're not as excited, and then their family's going to feel that. And then the kid goes and does their homework and they're bummed because mom was cranky because she'd had a bad day. Like, all of these things that happen to build better communities, we have to build better work environments because we spend a lot of time at work. And it's part of it. We are ecosystems. We are not these columns of things that do not touch.
Absolutely.
And the leaders play a very important role to the ecosystems of families.
And there's so much work on employee engagement. And, when employee engagement is good, productivity is way
Oh,
better,
yeah.
profitability
Mhm.
is way better. And employee engagement here isn't just a bonus
Mm-mm.
or a day off or anything like that. It's exactly
Mhm.
what we're talking about, what you
Yeah.
do, actually,
Mhm.
right? It's
Yeah.
an authentic connection where now I care about this company. I care about
Mhm.
the other employees. I care, that's it.
Yeah.
Then there you are, right?
hmm Yeah. And, when we are in a place where we feel valued and that perfectionism isn't required and our fear is reduced, then our prefrontal cortex is all opened up and firing. And so that we're getting that good stuff, we're getting the innovation. And, you cannot have innovation without being comfortable with failure because they're like left
Yes,
and right, light and dark. And so when you create these environments where failure is not allowed, then you need to accept the fact that there'll be no decisions or innovation either.
correct.
And that's a big piece that I don't think people understand how closely connected those two things are.
Yep, absolutely. Um, yeah, I have a friend who had a family business, auto parts, and he wrote a book. We wrote a book together about it, and he was very, very sensitive to a lot of his employees' needs and would go out of his way to reinforce them and just some amazing things.
Mhm,
Um, and he'd get letters from family members thanking him. I
mhm,
mean, one time he gave somebody who did something really well, his family a week in this beautiful house in Martha's Vineyard or something.
mhm.
And the grandmother who was dying of cancer wrote to him and said, "This was the most special week. Thank you." I mean, gosh, if you're doing
Yeah,
stuff like that for people, what are they
yeah.
not going to do for you, right?
Exactly. And I think, so often that we're trying to, protect ourselves as the executive or the owner, especially if it's, a family owned or individual owned business. It's all about I'm the boss and you guys are my employees and I'm protecting. And every time you build a protection brick in that wall, your team is less likely going to deliver. And, oftentimes I have to tell founders, this was your dream, not theirs. And so you have to share in the dream or they're never going to help you deliver it.
Right. If people don't see their role in the dream, they
Mhm.
don't see the purpose of it. If it's just going to
Yeah.
work,
Mhm.
forget it. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll be whatever the next better paying job or whatever, they're off.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah. And especially if that person's living this like lavish lifestyle and not helping out others or, making people feel poorly about themselves, but yet they have this amazing, big lifestyle, again, so no one's going to want to, help you build this lavish lifestyle on their back.
Right. They're not going to relate. But if you're
Mm-mm.
first in the morning and last out at night,
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
helps. Right.
Yeah. And if
Um,
you share in the reward,
mhm.
or when things aren't going well, the first instinct is protect the team versus yourself. We recently had a big storm here in Texas, and one of my clients, she let the entire team have the week off because of issues and didn't make them take vacation. And I know it cost her a ton of money. And she said it was the right thing to do, and I'll get that money back on the backside. And she's absolutely
Absolutely.
right.
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
Absolutely right.
Yep.
And I had other clients that didn't respond that way. They
Hmm.
were, tracking PTO by the second. And now these people won't be able to take a vacation this year. So they're going to be like, it's all, there's more than one way to make a dollar. And not always is it by trying to save it and keep it away from your team.
Yeah, absolutely. And your team are your team,
Mhm.
and they're part of it too. And if they don't feel that, that's either something you've done or they're in the wrong spot, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
And yeah, you work together as a team. That's an amazing, when you do, that's an amazing connection that you have. And certainly that helps the brain processes,
Mhm.
the sense of bonding, the mirror neurons and all that stuff. That connection is invaluable. It's invaluable. You can't put a price on that, I don't think.
No, you can't. You cannot put a price on it, and you never know when it will come back. And always give more than you expect in return. And when you treat your employees that way, your business will always be successful.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I've done some work with an interesting guy who's a philanthropist, humanist, humanitarian. He shows up where there are hurricanes or what have you, and passes out, free gas to people who are stuck on the
Mhm.
highway.
Love
And
that.
yeah, and they say, "Oh, thank you so much," and he says, "No, thank you. I
Mhm.
love doing this. You're doing something for me as much as I'm doing something for you," and
Mhm.
that's amazing, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you feel that leaders are getting this now? Because this is, as you said, the last 20 years, we've learned a lot more about how the brain works, how performance works. Do you think leaders today are getting it, or are they still, some of them still stuck in a sort of 20th century, I'm the boss mentality?
I think there is a wide spectrum, and there are quite a few on both ends. And um, I think that the reason why that happens is no one ever wakes up one day and says, I just love being a great leader and I'm just going to hire a bunch of people and we're just going to do some great work together. I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to be great. No one does that. Everyone has an idea for a product, a service, a widget, something, and then they're forced to create a team to make that come true. And so I think that is why oftentimes we struggle with leadership is it's not what we woke up to do that day. We woke up to for our widget or our service. And so it's the necessity, right? And I think that so many people have been able to attach success to an old way of leading. And instead of saying, hey, maybe since my entire team all of a sudden is revolting, maybe it's me and maybe I have something to learn, but instead they just continue to blame because they cannot detach themselves from previous success and understand what future success might look like. And I think those who struggle at the end of the day, that's their biggest issue is they're so ingrained into their past success that they can't see a change in the future.
Yes, and certainly if you look at communication in society generally,
Mhm.
we've been going the wrong way there for last few years, right? It's
Absolutely.
become very egocentric and narcissistic and bullying and all of that stuff,
Mhm.
which I suspect has impacted the culture. So that also might be one reason why there are some leaders who think the way to lead is by yelling and screaming and
Mhm.
that. Uh,
Yeah.
but I personally don't think that works.
It doesn't. And it works for a short time. And
Hmm.
crisis, and that's crisis management. The
Hmm.
building's on fire, get out, don't ask questions, do what I said. And that works only in high crisis. But what happens is we have a crisis and we lead that way. Then all of a sudden we get in this habit of constantly crisis management. And as things start to deteriorate, we try to get even more directive, more yelling. And so we're creating this spiral downward through our actions. But yeah, crisis management works about, 1% of the time. And it only works if it's a crisis, only if the building's on fire.
Yeah, that's right.
Mhm.
Which some people might think is on fire, but it really isn't.
Yeah.
For them it's on fire, but for everyone else,
Mhm.
it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure you did a lot of work with teams too, because we talked about communication and expectation,
Mhm.
and of course, when you get a few people together, then that potentially multiplies the problem, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What sort of work do you train teams? Do you give them? How do you do that?
Yeah. So when you're working with teams, we use a lot of the same principles. But the nice thing about working with teams is you've got a group of people collectively trying new skills and new competencies, and they kind of start to help each other with that. And I always think that's just incredible because if you're, one person and trying to change how you talk to your team and, you're doing all of this, you're kind of, this one person, lifting this huge boulder. But when there's a team, and that's why we do a lot of leadership academies in groups. So, the team helps all the boats rise, they just keep, kind of that accountability together. And I think also when I look at modern leadership, the days of being an employee that expects your boss to manage the team and that no one can do anything unless the manager is there. No, you have to learn how to manage as a group, and you have to learn how to, self-manage collectively because of the pressures and the intensity of our work environment today. You can't expect the boss to do it all, especially, when you think
Right.
about a CEO. I'll talk to vice presidents and executives, and they're like, well, the CEO hasn't gotten us all together in 6 months. And I was like, I don't think that's a CEO's job. I
Right.
think at your level, you guys should be, collectively managing the future of the organization. And so when we do teamwork, it's a lot about the team coming together and understanding that, they are as important, if not more important, in how they self lead as the bosses on how they lead them.
You mean Jeff Bezos isn't down running the packaging department?
I
Huh?
know. Crazy
Hmm.
how that works, isn't
Yeah, man. For
it?
all the money he makes.
You'd think he
Uh,
would be driving his Amazon van,
yeah, really.
throwing
Never seen
packages.
him in one. Yeah, man. Okay, so we've reached this point.
Mhm.
Uh, I am going to ask you a question. Will
Okay.
you come back a second time and talk to us about the seven deadly sins of leadership? Because we've just kind of hinted at it, but we haven't gone into it. Will you come and do that?
Absolutely. I would
Okay.
love to do that. And it's all about the addiction to being right and talk
Oh,
about how that addiction starts to play with the deadly sins. It's a fun conversation.
well, we'll set aside a time shortly to do that. In the meantime, tell people about where they can reach you. We have that in the show notes, but again, people sometimes don't read the show notes.
So we are at 304coaching.com, and you can also connect with me directly on LinkedIn at Jen Thornton ACC, and we can continue the conversation there.
Excellent. Well, Jen, thank you so much. Definitely want you to come back, and we will have a second conversation about the seven deadly sins of leadership, which I'm sure you will be able to enlighten us very significantly about. I'm sure people have their own views too. Um, but it's been great having you on the show. I really, really appreciate it, and it's been awesome.
Thank you for having me. I could sit and talk with you all day.
I think that's right. I'm in the wrong business. Okay. So wait for the second one because it's going to be just as good, folks. And until then, yeah, stay well, keep out of trouble, and remember to think about your thinking. Okay.